So altogether it was about a 2-year span that I was abroad. I just moved back about 6 months ago, getting over the culture shock, so to speak. I think I'm pretty used to it. But yeah, so I was fortunate enough when I was in Oaxaca to get involved with a volunteer project of my own. I kind of felt very, very lucky to see all the different projects and see all the different volunteer experiences that the participants were having, and be able to kind of make that decision on my own where I wanted to involve myself and where I had the time to do that. So in Oaxaca, I was working at a school in a rural community. It was more like a community center, and they didn't have a local school in that area, but they had language classes and computer literacy classes on the weekends for the kids. So I got involved with teaching English there. There was another English teacher there as well, and she had, her husband was living in the States, and so she had very basic English skills. But I went in and was working with her on developing curriculum and then leading the classes alongside her. And they had a very high level of students that year, and so it was great. We kind of split up the classes based on levels, and were teaching. She was doing the beginners, I was doing the advanced, and we would share kind of our techniques and some of our curriculum. And then when I was in Peru, I was working with a group of women. We had 2 women's groups that we were coordinating with, who were they were knitting, and then the volunteers from the program were helping to sell those products and helping them develop business plans and kind of learn about the process and become sustainable. And to be honest, a lot of that volunteer project consisted of just sitting with them while I knitted and talking with them, which was really lovely for me and I think for them as well. And that was I was there for 3 months, and I was coordinating the volunteers on that project, and then also going up by myself and just spending time with them and helping determine what they needed, and also developing some like team building and community building projects as well. So that's kind of, I guess, and then in Belize I was doing more of a coordinating job and working with university groups coming in and individuals as well. So that's kind of like the base level, I guess, of what I was doing.
Okay. And how did you get there? Like, what was your motive? Like before the precursor, what was the motivation and what inspired you to volunteer? What was it?
To be honest, living there, I didn't start volunteering probably until about 5 months after I was living in Oaxaca, and really getting to know people and forge those relationships, which I think can sometimes be the most difficult hurdle to get over when you're traveling in a foreign country. Made me really want to be involved on a deeper level. Not just, having Mexican friends is really, really wonderful, but also learning about the culture. What are some of the struggles? What are some of the ways that I can contribute, so that I'm not just kind of skimming the surface here, and I'm actually involving myself. Not necessarily, I don't know how to, it sounds negative to say this, but not necessarily just taking from the culture, but also being able to put myself into it as well. And I felt really similarly in Peru. In Belize, I just didn't really have time, but in Peru as well, feeling my desire to get to the deeper level, if you will, just past the normal tourist experience, and kind of understanding, what are the internal complications here, what, in what ways do people open up to you too, if you're involved on that level, as opposed to just, coming through, taking pictures, or, coming through and seeing the sights. And I'm really glad I did it, because it really changed my experience in all of the places that I was, to be able to kind of take that different perspective and be a volunteer.
And what would you say, was your perspective of volunteering? What did volunteering mean to you before you left? What was the concept to you?
It changed, certainly. I think I saw it much more as an area of privilege, I guess, to be able to come in and offer my services, I guess. I think personally I knew I wanted to give back, and that was certainly a motivation behind it. But going into it, I definitely had this idea of, I'm coming from a place with many more resources and a place of privilege, and that it would be, really beneficial to be able to contribute that to a place with less resources. But I certainly changed my opinion of kind of what my role was and what volunteering was when I was there as volunteer.
Interesting. In the general perspective, so like talking about volunteering, what do you notice like people focus on versus maybe what they should focus on when it comes to volunteering? Like what have you seen, the tendency to before they go, the motives or the preparational mentality versus what would, having been there and also coordinated, what do you think people should really be kind of like remembering, or what's some points that you think are very key?
Well, the main thing that I thought I saw from the volunteer perspective when I was coordinating was this sense of like, what are we going to accomplish while we're here as a volunteer? From start to finish in this project, what's going to be a deliverable outcome, and how can I, factor this in and schedule it, and by this day have this accomplished, by this day have this accomplished. And I think that volunteers got really frustrated by that expectation not being met when they were on site. A lot of the times because the culture that they were in had a really different concept of, what's a successful project, how quickly does time move, what are the ways that contributing can be valuable. And I think that, like a lot of the times, a good example is we'd have a group there and we give them a schedule. This is what's going to happen, and say in big bold letters at the bottom, schedule is subject to change, and almost every single day it would change just because, things come up. Maybe we'd go to a community one day and they would be having a ceremony for someone's birthday or, a burial, and you couldn't do any work that day, and that's just because that's how the culture is. And they'd be frustrated and say, oh, well, why couldn't we work on this? We're never going to finish in time. But I think that the people who had the most valuable experiences, and personally I did, was the relationship building that they were able to accomplish, and being able to kind of break through those barriers of trust and really be able to communicate more on a peer-to-peer level, as opposed to coming in and saying, okay, as a volunteer I'm going to do this by the time that I leave, and seeing it much more as kind of a reciprocal experience. So I think, taking away those more US-based structural expectations of, time and speed and efficiency, and seeing it more as, like let it wash over you, go in and make those relationships. And sometimes the most successful volunteer projects weren't the people who had been, had accomplished that as much numerically, but who had, made those lasting relationships and, broken through that barrier of trust. And then the second thing, and we talked about this a lot with the volunteers and orientations, was the idea of community service versus community partnership. And the idea of, I think myself personally, when I went in as a volunteer, I thought about volunteering as community service, as in offering my services and coming as, from a place of privilege, as opposed to the idea of community partnership, which is going in and more being on a peer-to-peer level and seeing, with your skills and with my skills, what can we accomplish and how can we create a system that's sustainable? Or, how can we connect in a way that's really going to benefit both of us? And it's a really different mentality to be going into a project with, I think. And that certainly, when I was involved in volunteer projects, changed it for me in terms of seeing it that way, and not seeing it as, a service that I'm bringing to somebody, more of, based on my background and your background, how can we better the situation, and how can we improve the organization here, or, the interactions that you're having, or whatever it might be. I think those were the most kind of eye-opening things for me.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. A great comment. Really like that when we were talking about like before today, the community service versus community partnership.
Yeah.
You know, the concept of instead of just giving, it's kind of like engaging,
Absolutely.
which is a whole different. Doesn't really enter the volunteer's mind.
Yeah.
Honestly enough. You hit on a good point there. Like right at the beginning, talking about entering a different culture. What did you learn? How did you learn how to deal with those different cultures and not your original mentality?
It took some time. It absolutely took some time. I think the longer I was there, the more that it helped settle in. I've always been a late person, but a lot of the volunteers were very attached to being timely, you know, and that being very important. And I think the concept of time is a huge cultural divide in terms of, especially in Latin America, I mean, things just go at their own pace and it's much slower than here. And I think time was very, very helpful, but also just trying to understand, you know, more of the history of the culture, the background of the culture. I feel like I was, you know, I had kind of a leg up in having lived in Mexico before I started volunteering there and having more of that concept of how the culture worked. But we definitely encourage the volunteers to do a lot of background research and understanding what are these things, you know, what makes people tick, you know, what are the cultural specificities of where you're going, and being able to at least plant that in your mind beforehand to understand, oh, maybe this is why this is happening. Maybe even though, you know, it's different than the way my culture works, there's a very specific reason for it. And that understanding, or at least trying to get to that understanding, I think is really, really helpful.
Cool. And what do you recommend then to people that are thinking about going? Is there something you do beforehand that kind of like softens you up, or do you believe you just jump in the water?
I think a balance, for sure, yeah. It depends what type of person you are. Some people like to know everything before they go, and some people like to just jump in. I think in terms of the very basics, at least doing a little bit of background research and understanding a little bit about the culture and maybe cultural expectations and cultural norms. Because even though we are all really open-minded people, sometimes it can feel abrasive if something's happening that goes totally counter to the way that you've been raised or that you expect culture to work. So I think that doing at least a little bit of background research and understanding can be really helpful. And I don't know, I think it can be helpful to talk to other people who've been to that location or who volunteered before, or maybe in an area that you're hoping to volunteer, just to get their perspective, maybe not to let it completely cloud your perspective or your expectations, but at least to have that as a grain of salt to take into consideration, I think could be really helpful. But I think in general, just going in without too many expectations it sounds, I don't know, it sounds kind of weird to say have low expectations. And I wouldn't say have low expectations, but have few expectations. Because I think you can be really surprised by things, and if you're really locked into a structure of what it's going to be like, it can sometimes hinder the experience. But yeah.
Okay. Keeping on the theme of pre-work and investigation.
Yeah.
A very common concern with people thinking about volunteering is, how do I know this thing is credible? How do I know it's legit? How do you find out bad programs and good programs, and what does that mean?
Yeah.
Bad and good.
Well, there are a lot of programs out there, and some people choose to go with a program, some people choose to go on their own. But I think that engaging in conversation, doing research, and, you know, there's so much info on the web now. You know, how people's programs were, which ones are, I mean, they're definitely the most credible ones, the ones that are vetted by other organizations. But I think that, yeah, doing that research and talking to alums of programs, and then calling the programs themselves and saying, you know, what's your program like? Why did you decide to do these projects? Why did you decide to go to these locations? What is I think an interesting one to ask is, what is the length of time that you require for a volunteer to be on site? Because in my personal experience, the longer that you're there, the more you're integrated into the culture, and I'm really able to get a lot more out of it as a volunteer, I think. But also going in and talking about sustainability, asking what happens after I leave, and seeing how those program representatives respond. Are these sustainable projects? Are they ones that you're working hand in hand with, or are you just gonna contribute to a project and leave, and then it'll just sit by the wayside until somebody else comes and picks it up? It's a really good question to ask that, I think. And also, depending on what you need or what you want, how much does the program provide you? Because programs are interesting in that it is a really, there's a lot of structure to programs for a reason in terms of volunteering abroad, because a lot of times you go in and you don't know which projects are sustainable. You don't have those relationships. You don't know if the organization is going to be treating you well as a volunteer. And so a lot of programs have kind of done that vetting for you. And this is not to say that going through a program is worse or better than going by yourself. I am totally a neutral standpoint here. But I think that going in and asking those questions, and then seeing if they're going to be sending you up with a homestay, are they going to be greeting you at the airport, are they going to get you into language classes, how important is the language skill where you're going, and do you want to go in and have all those things there for you or not? And can you pick and choose a program that'll offer you some but not others? All of those things are good to take into consideration, for sure.
So I know I'm ditching from our non-how-to mantra here at
No,
Waypost, but I wanted to ask you brought up a great point. You're talking about asking how long do they require the volunteers stay?
Yeah.
Period. The mentality of volunteering is so subjective. I mean, people who go down, we're going down to Mexico for a week, or we're going out for a month, or people that are just like, I'm going down for like 2 years.
Yeah.
Or you're like Sean Penn in Haiti, and you go, and you don't know when you're done. You're just day by day. What's the importance and what's the factor of time? Like, what should someone be thinking in terms of that? And you brought up a really good point. How much do you require? Why is time so important, and what should be the angle to take on that? Like, how do you judge someone who wants to go? What does someone know? How long do they know to go?
I think it's totally individual, an individual decision. Personally, I think time is the most essential thing. I mean, the longer you're there, the more, it's like with anybody that the longer that you get to know them, the more you learn about them, the more perhaps you trust them, the more you understand them. And in terms of, contributing to the volunteer project, I think you build more of a partnership when you're able to really get to know somebody and they're able to trust you. You likewise are able to trust them. And you're able to delve deeper and see, in this project that I'm working on, what's working, what's not, how can we work together in order to structure it in a more beneficial way. But also, feeling like you're more part of the culture, I think also gives you a little bit more of a motivation to even be there contributing to this project, because you get really invested in it. You get really invested in the culture and the practices and why people do things the way that they do, and how your different perspective can actually be, lending a really interesting contribution to the project, and how much it becomes reciprocal. I think the longer you're there, the more you see how much you're learning from them and they're learning from you at the same time. And then in terms of how it's an individual decision, it's also, what do you want to accomplish while you're there? Do you want to go there to do relationship building? Or, do you want to go there and do you want to, say, build a school in a few weeks and then, leave that lasting impression or, that lasting kind of tangible thing? Or do you want to do a combination of the two? But there are different ways to, make a contribution as a volunteer, and that can be teaching for 6 months and getting to really know the students, or it can be, building water filters and distributing them to houses, and knowing, that in that week that you were there, you were able to really, offer, 20 families the opportunity to be drinking clean drinking water when they couldn't before you were So I think it's really subjective again, and I think it really depends on what are the outcomes that you want to achieve while you're there. What are your motivations for volunteering, and yeah, and what do you want to take from the experience as well as give to it.
So we've been talking about one whole side of the equation, and that's us, or us volunteering.
What about the locals? Like, what's your opinion on the people that we're going to visit or spend the time with? In our minds, go and help or work with, cooperate in partnership with. What are their expectations? Are there expectations? And like, as from what you've seen in your experience, what's the local angle on all this? What should someone know about that?
Yeah. I know I sound like a broken record, but I think trust is the biggest thing. And the locals can be distrustful, I think, up front, like, why is this person coming in for a few weeks and then leaving, or coming in for however long and leaving? And how do you, and I think there's an expectation to have to work for that trust, and to have to, really put yourself out there and open yourself up to practice that language that you've been learning, or go in and really go in with an open mind and say, oh, what is this, what does this aspect of your culture teach me? Or what's this project that we're working on? Let's work on it together, as opposed to, going in with a bunch of foreigners and speaking your own language amongst them and saying, okay, we're gonna, do this project for you, but we're not gonna really interact. And I think the homestay families, and I think the organizations themselves have, a lot of the ones that work with programs specifically, they've all had a lot of both positive and negative experiences, but they all know that volunteers come and they go, and that it's, it's a time thing. And getting to know, I think that they really expect you to have to work for that trust, and to have to do the work to understand their culture and integrate yourself. And then also, thinking about it from an organizational standpoint, having a volunteer is work. You have to train them, you have to supervise them, you have to give them projects to do. And so I think, proving that you're there and that you're willing to take on anything, or making those relationships so that it doesn't become so it's like a very fluid relationship where you come in and you can say, I can do this today if you need help, or I'm a really quick learner, you can teach me how to do this, and then I'll be able to do it. But that's where time comes in too, going in and getting into a rhythm, like in any job that you would do. It takes a little while to get acclimated. But I think that I think cultures are very different. Some are more open than others, but certainly I think the organizations we worked with, they love having volunteers. They love that aspect of cultural exchange, being able to learn something new. They were all obviously very open because they were welcoming volunteers from another culture into their organizations, but going in with that open mind and that willingness to kind of give into that culture and learn about it and build that trust, I think is the biggest expectation that they have of the volunteers coming. Sorry if that was very random.
Not at all, actually. What would you say then are some preconceptions maybe about what locals think and whatnot that you've heard of, that maybe some you can kind of like dispel and like what have you heard what do you see people thinking locals are going to interpret or perceive, but rather it's not really true at all? I mean, like you mentioned trust, for example, is one thing, building trust. What is it about that you notice that people want you to earn the trust, kind of, or prove that you're going to be there? Why is that? What do people go in doing that maybe honest mistakes?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting situation, I think, and it's kind of ironic because I think that a lot of times the locals see the volunteers as takers, even though they're coming in to, be givers in that essence. Where they're like, okay, you're coming in and, you're taking a lot of obnoxious pictures of things that are, everyday life to me. Or you're coming in and you have come with this idea that you're going to be contributing, and yet you're speaking a language I can't understand with people around you, and you're not even interacting, with me per se. Or you're coming in with this idea of exactly what you want to do and exactly how you can help, without entering into discussion as to how you might be most beneficial to this project. I think those are three of the most common I don't know if I would say mistakes, but issues that resulted in mistrust, in kind of treating the situation as more of like a spectacle, even, taking lots of pictures and posting them on Facebook as opposed to, which is fine too, it's great to document those experiences, but I think there's a respectful way to do it and a way that feels kind of abrasive, and that made people distrustful, certainly. And yeah, going in and having it be a conversation. No one wants someone to come in and tell them how they should be doing something. And I think the idea of volunteering is much more of a partnership and a collaboration. And I think that especially a lot of, I don't know, we had different types of volunteers, but so I'd say some of the business volunteers would come in and they'd say, this is exactly how you should be running this organization, as opposed to, well, this is our culture and this is how it's been for the past, I don't know how many years, but we really want to improve it and would love your input as to, how we can do that within the framework that we're working in here. So, and because those situations have occurred, I think that's part of what's created some of those barriers and those trust issues, and the biggest thing is communication in order to move past those, or to say, wow, we don't have this at home. We've never eaten this before. I'd love to take a picture and show my friends back home, as opposed to like clicking away and kind of being up in your face about it.
Do you think, like in your experience, do you think that the people that are the locals that are being visited by the volunteers take away a lot more, or do you think the volunteer takes away a lot more?
I think it depends. I think in my experiences, the volunteers have taken away more than the locals. I would say that. I think a lot of the volunteers have been really surprised by how much they've taken away from it. And I mean, in a sense, when you go into another culture, you can use it almost as a mirror or as a contrast for what your own culture is and what's different, and what are the measures of success in this culture? How do they conceptualize time or happiness? And I think a lot of the volunteers, aside from being able to really contribute to these projects, and myself as well, you're taking away from it this just entirely different perspective on life. And you're able to integrate that into what you grew up with and what you're accustomed to. And you can really, myself, I feel like coming back, I just bought an iPhone a week ago after going 6 months without it because all my friends were telling me it was time. But just having time to yourself. The fact that I was in Peru and would spend 2 hours of every day just sitting on a mountain talking to ladies while I knitted, that is not something that would ever happen here. And to them, it's not, how many scarves am I going to knit in an hour to make this much money. It's, I'm just sitting right now, hanging out with the other women in my group. This is empowerment for us because it gets us out of the house and away from our husbands. And then when we sell this, we'll have a little bit of financial security. But it's not about, let's do this on the schedule. Let's sit on the mountain today and just chat. And it's just such a different way of looking at life. And I think that a lot of volunteers come away with, that really, it's right in front of you. There's no way to escape it. It's really change perspective of how other people lead their lives. And it's easy here now, it's so busy, it's easy to get wrapped up in that and to forget that there are other ways to do it. And so I think that's generally the biggest takeaway, and that's why it can really affect a volunteer maybe on a higher level than it would on the local. Which isn't to say that it's not a reciprocal relationship and that the locals don't learn from the volunteers, but I think that it's very drastic what a volunteer learns in perhaps even a much shorter period of time, because the contrast is so strong between what they came from and where they are as a volunteer.
Awesome, awesome. And so what do you think, like post coordinator Alana would be telling rookie volunteer Alana? What would her advice be?
Let go of expectations, for sure. And focus on the relationships. Go in, sit down, maybe go out to lunch with the supervisor of the project and get to know their family, get to know, what's got them interested in doing what they're doing, understanding, what are their motivations, where do they want to go, and building those relationships. Invite them over for dinner, go to their daughter's birthday party, and really learn about what the culture is all about, because I don't know, when you're able to go and contribute to something, and even when you're able to go into a volunteer project and say something about the culture that they are surprised that you would even know, it still opens it up. And especially like if you're going somewhere where they speak another language and you don't feel entirely comfortable in your language skills, use it anyway. Mess up a lot. Like have a lot of funny situations and let that be a relationship building moment. But go in, I think that personally going in with the relationship building as the main goal or the main motivator has been the most successful in terms of having a really worthwhile volunteer experience.
Awesome, awesome. And if you could go volunteer again, what would be the coolest thing to do? What's your little bucket list of volunteers? Do you have one?
Good question. I don't, but I'm sure I can think of one pretty quickly. I think getting more involved in public health would be really interesting. I really loved the public health project that we worked on, anywhere and everywhere. But the little things, it's really fun to find creative ways to integrate those into, say, a curriculum or into a project, and they go a really long way. Like the water filters, being able to go out and teach people about the importance of clean water. It's a tiny, tiny thing. When you have the tools and when you have the education, it makes a huge difference. So public health probably, and then wrapped up in that education. Those are kind of the two areas that I really love the most. Anywhere.
Awesome.
Specific location.
Awesome. Well, before we open up for Q&A, because some of you might have questions for Alana, Catherine and I actually did some background research, and I'll just actually be honest, Catherine did some background research, and because that's what she does week in and week out on this. So, and we actually spoke with two groups apart from Alana that deal in volunteering. One of them, we couldn't have their presence tonight. It was the Peace Corps. It was a little too immediate for them, but no worries. But funny enough, they pointed out, they made a couple comments to us that we wanted to cite here. And they had two pieces of advice. First of all, they said, be adaptable and open-minded. And then also, when we were volunteering, the countries are not asking us to come and change them. All right, so it's kind of an interesting perspective on sometimes what maybe volunteering has in the head. And then we also spoke with another group called GoOverseas.com. And one of their ladies is about to produce a very exclusive, we exclusively got our hands on, a new post that's coming out about 50 things she learned while volunteering, working at Go Overseas, which coordinates volunteer programs and whatnot. So, and I wanted to point these out because these are completely three different sources, yet we're going to tie them all together because listen to these 4 points. Long-term programs are almost always better. Local culture is important, so immerse yourself. All too often, volunteering abroad becomes more about the volunteer than the community. And then finally, prepare as much as you can, but don't have expectations. So once again, we're talking about time, we're talking about expectations, considering the locals and whatnot. And so we wanted to point that out, that there's, when you see these common threads, it's kind of like hints or free advice. We'd love to open up the floor to any Q&A. Anyone have any questions for Alana? Definitely pick her brain because she knows what she's talking about. Richard, please.
Quick question on it. When you were sitting on the mountaintop knitting, were you speaking and chatting in English, Spanish, or Quechua?
In Spanish, and I learned how to count to 5 in Quechua.
Well done.
Good question. Yeah.
I was actually kind of wondering, like as Americans, what kind of contribution we can give, like what kind of contributions are needed versus stuff that can be taken care of by locals, because I know that was kind of an issue, a little bit of conflict between the locals and the
Definitely. I think it really depends on the project and the situation. An interesting one was our health projects. I think we had a lot of pre-med students come and they learned a lot from doing hands-on work, but also came in with a really interesting health perspective. A lot of times the health systems can really vary country to country, and I think that it was, especially the long-term health volunteers, had a lot of perspective to offer, like the smaller clinics, and public health as well, I think, was really helpful.
Did you see anything with like business development
Absolutely.
Stuff too? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
An interesting part of the women's project actually is we had a group from, I can't remember what university it was, but they came in and they spent maybe a month with the groups really getting to know them, and then they developed a prospective business plan. And then we brought that to the women for them to review and see if they want to incorporate any aspects of that, which they did. But yeah, that's, and in English, obviously, huge. Good question.
Where did you live? Meaning, did all the volunteers kind of share the same house or lodgings, or was it totally up to each of you to find your own, room in a local family's house, or how was that
That's
done?
such a good question, and I think it has such a huge effect on your volunteer experience. In terms of if you're living with a local family, or you're living
in a hotel,
or if you're living with other volunteers. My personal experiences really varied. In Oaxaca, I lived just on my own in an apartment with friends.
With American friends?
With American friends, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I lived in a complex actually that had people from all over. So my neighbor was German, and my upstairs neighbor was from Chile, all over the place.
And why was that there were so many people of different nationalities in that one?
That was just a really random situation. That wasn't through the program at all. It was my own. It was like my own living situation, and it just happened to be an apartment complex with.
But is that common, where it's totally up to you to find your own housing situation?
In most programs, it's not. In most programs, they put you in a homestay family, or they put you in like a group housing situation. So, for example, in our Belize site, we have the program I worked for had a bunkhouse, and the groups generally would stay in the bunkhouse, but then the volunteers had the option of either staying in the bunkhouse, like the individual volunteers, in the bunkhouse, or with a homestay family. And that's it's a really interesting decision. Do you want to, wake up speaking Spanish and eating Peruvian food, or do you want to, wake up amongst some of your peers? And obviously they're, not to say that one is worse than the other, but I loved living with family. In Peru, I lived with a family, and in Belize, I was in the bunkhouse. But I really, really loved it. I mean, I'm still in touch with the family that I lived with, and they just invited me to their daughter's quinceanera, and they were really, really wonderful people that I will go back and visit. I was able to forge a really strong relationship with them. And homestays are, they're a mixed bag. Sometimes people love them, sometimes people hate them, sometimes people feel like totally bad about them. And but I would encourage people to at least start with a homestay if they feel comfortable, because I think it's a really interesting window into the culture. But yeah, in our program specifically, most people would stay with homestays. If we did have the option of the bunkhouse, then people would have that option as well. That's a good question.
You got it.
Yeah.
I have a specific question.
Yeah.
What organization do you volunteer for in Sacred Valley?
I worked with Pro World.
Okay, I was just there last year with Alamati.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh
I
my
volunteered
gosh.
for a month there with Alamati.
Wow. Tiny world, yeah. Did you enjoy your experience?
It was amazing. The only downside was I didn't stay long enough. I stayed for a month, and that simply was just not enough time. At least for me.
Yeah.
I guess it can be different for other people, but to really integrate yourself, right, like 3 months. They actually Alamati extended the minimum stay there to 3 months.
Oh, really?
Yeah, after meeting a couple other volunteers who just kind of came in and out, they were like, all right, we need to start making it a little bit longer.
Yeah. Did you feel like a month was going to be a long time before you went?
I did it first, yeah. I was 17, so I was like, oh man, like, I was kind of freaking out a little bit, but I really wanted to do it, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah.
Are there more people here with volunteer experience? No one? So who's thinking of actually going volunteering in the near future? You're going?
Yeah, I've been considering doing something through in Ecuador or in Spain. In Ecuador, it would be the one weird thing about this program is that they were saying something on the site about donations. Like they accept donations for volunteering, which just that was a little odd to me because I thought, well, I'm volunteering. That was just a little odd. Maybe that's something that's common. But it'd be working with special needs kids, speaking Spanish, teaching yoga even on the beach. It sounded really neat. Versus another opportunity, which would be basically taking care of this woman's, a wealthy woman's children and teaching them English in Spain on the Costa Brava. So it's like two very different experiences that I'm kind of weighing what I might wind up doing. But I would love to, when you're talking about how long to stay, I'm thinking like, oh man, a couple weeks certainly isn't long enough.
Yeah.
I know because
So
I
it'll
was
fly by.
Yeah, because I was in Peru a year ago at this time for 2.5 months, and that time kind of flew by there too.
Did you enjoy it there?
Oh yeah, I loved it. I worked with a shaman and maybe that's a whole other travel type because it was quite an experience. That's for sure. So wonderful.
If you have questions about Ecuador, Leah has lived 5 years in Ecuador. So you can pick his brain if there's.
Puerto Lopez, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice.
Okay. All right. We'll pick your brain.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyone else is thinking you're thinking
I
of
was
doing?
going to month in Guatemala. I
Oh.
back there. That was my experience.
What did you do there?